Let me start by thanking our musicians, Alturas Duo, who played just before I came up. Welcome to the 31st Annual Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Awards. I'm John Cavanagh, Director of the Institute for Policy Studies, and I'll be your host tonight. So thank you. This evening, our awards highlight extreme bravery, perseverance in the struggle for justice, and a courageous and brilliant mass exercise of our constitutional rights by members of the military. Last year, in this hall, the Letelier-Moffitt Selection Committee gave an award to Maher Arar, the Canadian Syrian who survived torture as an innocent victim of George Bush's disastrous war on terror. 2 months later, the previously unknown Maher Arar was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And you know who didn't even make the list? George Bush. Oh. Many of us in this room have spent 31 years fighting for justice in the case of our colleagues Ronni Karpen Moffitt and Orlando Letelier, who were killed here in Washington in 1976 by agents of the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. From that moment onward, IPS has hosted this awards program in their names, transforming grief into a search for light among the shadows of tyranny. And so, in this room, full of people, these are people who understand the need for persistence. Year in and year out, we have demanded that Augusto Pinochet be brought to justice. And we came close, very, very close. Much closer, in fact, than any of us had dreamed. Pinochet spent his last years in disgrace under house arrest. And even though he died last year, we continue to see measures of justice. 2 weeks ago, Chilean authorities arrested 6 members of Pinochet's family, including his wife and children, along with 18 of his henchmen. A judge had found more evidence showing what we already knew, that Pinochet was not only a mass murderer, but also a thief. And so tonight, we salute all those who have kept this struggle alive for more than 3 decades. And I would say none more than the family that is here in this room, Isabel Letelier, her son Christian Letelier, their nephew Rodrigo Leyva. Thank you so much for what you do and for being here. Yeah. Oh. At our office at IPS, we have a mural that brings to life some of the most inspiring social justice movements of the past 4 decades. It was created by our board member, who's here tonight, owner of Busboys and Poets, Andy Shalal. A man who has made Washington a better place to be a progressive. This remarkable work of art shows the movement for civil rights, for peace, for human rights, the movements against nuclear weapons and against corporate globalization. Please stop in sometime, visit us to see the mural. It's your history, and it's also the history of IPS. And today, our staff of 30 is drawing lessons from these struggles to turn ideas into action for peace, justice, and the environment. At IPS, we have the wild idea that it's not enough to buy light bulbs, efficient light bulbs, and hybrid cars. To save the planet, we need a fundamental energy and economic transformation. We have the equally wild notion that it's not enough to end poverty. We also need to end the extreme inequality that is pulling apart our country and our world. And we have the wild notion that it's not enough to end the Iraq War. It's not even enough to prevent a new one in Iran. We need a completely new foreign policy based on justice. So we are inspired by Orlando Letelier and Ronni Moffitt, by Maher Arar and our other awardees, and by all of you who have been with us through so many struggles. And we're not afraid to be bold. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the presenter of our first Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Award, the award for outstanding work in Latin America and the Caribbean. Long before the Washington Post made her famous with a series of articles on her opposition to the Iraq War, our first presenter put in many years in the trenches. You'd never guess it to look at her, right over here. But in 1969, she led the consumer fight to put expiration dates on products in supermarkets. Yes, while many of you were in grade school or not born, she was making sure that your milk was fresh. She went on to champion the rights of the elderly, of women, and the environment, so that by the time she entered Congress in 1998, she had 3 decades of organizing experience under her belt. And she has used these skills beautifully, rising quickly to the top tier of the Democratic House hierarchy as Chief Deputy Whip. More importantly, she has proved courageous, traveling to places like Iraq and Colombia, and speaking out boldly for peace and justice. And just to show you how fearless she is, she's also a proud co-sponsor of a bill to impeach the Vice President. Please, please welcome, and one thing I just want to say before I call up Jan, this award, once Jan has presented it, will be accepted by Senator Petro, who speaks in Spanish. He will be translated consecutively by Charlie Roberts, a fabulous translator who just accompanied Evo Morales across the U.S. And so we're going to, just to warn all of you presenters and awardees, we have a wonderful timekeeper here who has signs in front of you, and Senator Petro, you all have 7 minutes. Senator Petro gets a bit more because of Charlie. So please welcome Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. No, sit down. Thank you so much. Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to IPS for speaking truth to power for so many years. You know, when people in the United States speak of political courage, they often refer to politicians who take unpopular stances and risk losing a few percentage points off of their reelection margins. But in Colombia, political courage means something else entirely. Courageous legislators often face threats of kidnapping or assassination. In Colombia today, there is no politician more threatened than the person we are honoring tonight. Senator Gustavo Petro is inundated with death threats like the way the rest of us are spammed with email. He risks daily assassination because he dares to expose one of the biggest political scandals in Colombian history, one that dwarfs Richard Nixon's Watergate conspiracy in scope. It has become known as parapolitics scandal, which links right-wing paramilitary drug trafficking death squads with politicians allied with President Álvaro Uribe. As one of the leaders of the leftist opposition party, Senator Petro cannot move without a phalanx of bodyguards and a protective Kevlar vest. He cannot leave the safety of the Colombian Congress even to have lunch or dinner. Neither can he safely travel within his own country or even its capital. Indeed, simply traveling here to receive this award was a calculated risk for which we thank him very much. I was asked I was asked to present Senator Petro with the Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Award because I've been an outspoken opponent of U.S. support for Plan Colombia since it was first debated 8 years ago. I traveled to Colombia in 2001. Thank you. I traveled to Colombia in 2001 along with my colleague Jim McGovern from Massachusetts, and it was clear to us after meeting with the coca-growing campesinos in rural Colombia that sending guns and helicopters wasn't going to solve the problem of addiction in the United States, and it certainly wasn't going to solve the problem of poverty and lack of economic alternatives in the Andes. Moreover, U.S. policy virtually ignored the snowballing paramilitary problem in Colombia. But the Bush administration has always framed our Colombia policy as a simplistic war on drugs in which exerting enough coercion by fumigating peasant farmers could somehow make the problem go away. After the attacks of September 11th, the Bush administration made Colombia the South American front of the global war on terror, despite the fact that Colombia had no connection to al-Qaeda, as didn't Iraq, by the way, but that's another matter. Thus, the policy was rebranded as a fight against the so-called narco-terrorist guerrillas. To be sure, the guerrillas of the FARC do indeed practice drug trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and assassinations, but the administration's one-dimensional depiction of the incredibly complex situation in Colombia scarcely mentioned the role of right-wing paramilitary death squads. But they were the enemy of our enemy because they fought against the guerrillas, so the Bush administration essentially turned a blind eye toward paramilitarism. By all accounts, the paramilitaries have been even more deeply involved in drug trafficking and massacres than the guerrillas. But why were they barely acknowledged by our government? Could it be that the paramilitaries had thoroughly enmeshed themselves with powerful economic and political interests within the Colombian establishment? These are the inconvenient truths that Senator Petro has been uncovering. Today, 41 members of Congress have been accused of having ties to paramilitary groups. Of these 41, 15 are currently arrested and imprisoned. Moreover, 40 of these 41 members of Congress belong to parties supported by the Uribe administration. Key officials of President Uribe's government have also been forced to step down because of their connections to paramilitaries, including his chief of intelligence. Senator Petro's dogged pursuit of paramilitary power led Colombia's most circulated news magazine, Semana, to name him the Person of the Year in 2006, ahead of pop star Shakira and President Uribe. The more he uncovers, the more intense the threats against him become as his investigations drew closer to the historical links between President Uribe and the paramilitaries. Uribe denounced Senator Petro as a terrorist in a business suit. This was a chilling threat in a country where far less serious accusations have been interpreted as a green light to assassination. Senator Petro was indeed a member of the M19 rebel movement many years ago, but they were demobilized in a peace process in 1990. He was a part of their political wing, and he never fired a shot, not unlike our own rebels, such as Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson. After he was demobilized and amnestied, Gustavo Petro was elected to the Constituent Assembly that helped rewrite Colombia's 1991 Constitution. He served in Colombia's Congress from 1990 to 1994 and from 1998 to 2006. And in March of 2006, he was elected to Colombia's Senate. Since the country's senators are elected on a national at-large basis, Senator Petro was the #2 vote-getter in the entire country. He has been the leading voice in Colombia's Congress, pushing for investigations into paramilitary infiltration of the country's institutions. When the details of the parapolitics scandal are finally proven and presented to the people and their government, will the Colombian executive, judicial, and legislative branches take action? The very legitimacy of the Colombian political system itself will be put to the test. If he succeeds, Gustavo Petro will threaten some of the most powerful elite interests in Colombia. Prominent members of the military, political, and economic sectors will have to account for their complicity in the atrocities committed by the paramilitaries. That is why his life is so threatened, and that is why we are honoring him tonight. The motto of the Institute for Policy Studies is to speak truth to power, and there are few people alive today who embody this principle more than the man we are honoring tonight. Before I present the award, we have a 4-minute video profile of Senator Petro produced by Selva Films. Let's look at the video.
Especialmente en lo relacionado con la gestión y operación del proyecto en la participación de las comisiones.
Así que lo que encontramos no solamente fue una relación entre la clase política más destacada del país, la que está hoy en el poder, el Estado o secciones muy importantes del Estado y el narcotráfico a través de lo que llamamos hoy paramilitarismo, sino que además eso es lo que ha permitido la extensión de un verdadero genocidio en Colombia. Yo creo que no hay un lugar en todo el continente americano en los últimos 40 años, incluyendo los procesos de dictaduras del Cono Sur y las centroamericanas, con mayor número de crímenes contra la humanidad y con mayor número de víctimas a través de estos crímenes contra la humanidad que el producido en el territorio colombiano.
¿Y qué opinas del senador Petro, del Polo Democrático?
No, también estoy de acuerdo. Súper bien, es una persona que va con el pueblo, que va con la gente del común.
A partir de allí el descubrimiento de fosas comunes ha sido ininterrumpido. Ahora son centenares los cadáveres que han salido y el fiscal habla de por lo menos 10.000 personas, muchas de ellas descuartizadas en vida, están allí sepultadas en esas fosas comunes.
Cuanto al senador Petro, es una persona que, de lo que conozco de él, parece una persona con unas posturas democráticas interesantes, ¿sí? Como una opción política que se mantiene dentro del polo y que pues, es una de las figuras más representativas, especialmente hoy en día, de la oposición.
Realicé el debate de Sucre en el Caribe colombiano. Pude encontrar con minuciosidad las relaciones que había entre la clase política de Sucre y el paramilitarismo y que llegaban hasta el Senado de la República. Y con muchas pruebas ocultas en procesos escondidos dentro de la Fiscalía que fui recuperando y acumulando, pude mostrarle a la opinión pública a través de un debate en el Congreso cómo eran esas relaciones entre congresistas de la República, parlamentarios, alcaldes, líderes políticos en una región específica como Sucre y el paramilitarismo.
Recibiendo a toda la gente del pueblo democrático, dándole la cordial bienvenida. El senador, se acerca el senador. Ahí viene el senador. Ahí viene el senador. Se acerca el senador. Vamos a recibir al senador también. Un fuerte aplauso. Un fuerte aplauso. Viene el senador. Viene llegando el senador. Viene llegando Gustavo Petro. Bienvenido. Te saluda tu amigo. Te saluda. Así que ustedes tienen una selección elección que hacer. O se elige la mafia, o se elige la democracia. ¿Qué elegimos?
¡Democracia!
I want to say a special thank you to the Senator because there have really been tangible results, even in our United States Congress now, because of his work, because of the exposure of the corruption and the imperiled brothers and sisters that we have in the trade union movement in Colombia. There will not be a Colombia Free Trade Agreement passed in the United States Congress. And so now it is my privilege to ask Senator Gustavo Petro to come forward and receive the 31st Annual Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Award.
Gracias. Se me duplica el tiempo por haber cometido la estupidez izquierdista de no aprender inglés.
My time's doubled because of having committed the leftist stupidity of not having learned English.
Tengo que decir que en los últimos días he recibido, ayer nomás, 2 clases de amenazas por el simple hecho de estar hablando con algunos congresistas del Partido Demócrata en los Estados Unidos. Los temas del TLC, afirmar que el TLC, tal cual lo firmaron Uribe y Bush, beneficia en el campo colombiano a los narcotraficantes. El ministro del Interior dijo que he cometido una actitud imperdonable. Dijo, Petro no tiene perdón, en el titular del diario El Tiempo.
I must say that just in recent days, just yesterday, I received 2 kinds of threats just for discussing the free trade agreement with Democrats from the U.S. Congress, and because what I was saying was that the free trade agreement supported by and Uribe supports drug traffickers in the Colombian rural areas. The Minister of Agriculture said that I've committed an unpardonable sin. It said in the Tiempo newspaper, Petro no tiene perdón, no pardon for Petro.
No sé qué implicación tiene eso de no tener ningún perdón en mi país, pero además recibí la amenaza de la contraparte del gobierno, las FARC, diciendo que yo lo que estaba aquí preparando era la candidatura de Wall Street en Colombia.
And I don't know what the implications of that are exactly in Colombia, but I've also received a threat from the counterpart of the government, which is to say the FARC, which has said that what I'm doing here in the United States is paving the way for Wall Street to come into Colombia.
Y tengo que decir que no he pasado de Colombian Heights.
And I really have barely been outside of Columbia Heights.
Estas 2 circunstancias me llevan a pensar si realmente es una utopía o se puede construir un diálogo entre las gentes diversas de este continente. Este continente lo pueblan afrodescendientes, indígenas, anglosajones, pueblos latinos en toda la América. Somos las mayorías y compartimos un solo continente.
And so these 2 circumstances lead me to wonder, is it a utopia? Is it possible to actually forge a dialogue among the many diverse peoples of this hemisphere? This hemisphere is made up of Afro-descendants, of indigenous peoples, of Anglo-Saxons, and of Latinos, and we are a majority here of the very many peoples who make up the population in this part of the world.
Podemos decidir si esta formidable diversidad la encaminamos hacia la confrontación y construimos, como en Europa, 1000 años de guerras entre nosotros, o la llevamos hacia el diálogo entre civilizaciones diferentes, haciendo de esta diversidad una igualdad entre diferentes. Si es posible que los pueblos diferentes, las civilizaciones diferentes que compartimos un mismo continente, podamos simplemente conversar.
So we have to decide whether this formidable diversity among ourselves is going to be something that we're going to take to a confrontation like 1,000 years of wars in Europe, or whether we're going to engage in a dialogue among these different civilizations, these different peoples, making this diversity into a dialogue of our diversity.
Yo soy miembro del partido de la segunda opción, el partido de la conversación, del diálogo. Y en esa medida he encontrado una serie de experiencias, incluso en esta misma reunión, absolutamente pedagógicas y dicientes.
And I'm a member of the party that goes with the second option, a party that is for dialogue, and I've found various interesting paths in that regard in this very meeting.
Descubrí, por ejemplo, que yo vivo exactamente igual que los soldados norteamericanos en Irak.
I discovered that my life, for example, is just like that of the U.S. soldiers in Iraq.
Como ellos vivo en un carro blindado, como ellos vivo en una casa blindada, como ellos no puedo salir a la calle, ni ir a almorzar en un restaurante, ni bailar en una discoteca. Como ellos me puede caer un rocket sobre mi carro blindado y acabar con esta simple conversación.
I discovered that like them, I go around in an armored car. Like them, I live in an armored house. Like them, I can't go out on the street. I can't go out to a restaurant or for a meal or to a discotheque to go dancing. And like them, a rocket might fall upon my armored car at any time and end this simple conversation.
La única diferencia es que ellos quieren regresar a su país y yo me quiero quedar en el mío.
The only difference is they want to go back to their country and I want to stay in my country.
Indudablemente tenemos que dialogar porque en esos desiertos del Medio Oriente hay soldados colombianos bajo contrato del gobierno de los Estados Unidos. También ellos quieren regresar. Hay contratistas, ciudadanos colombianos a los cuales se engañaron para llevarlos a Irak y ellos quieren regresar. Ellos quieren acabar esa guerra.
No doubt. We have to look, for example, in the streets in the Middle East, in the deserts of the Middle East. No doubt we must engage in dialogue. In those Middle Eastern deserts, there are Colombian soldiers as well who are under contract to the U.S. government, who were taken there, deceived, and they too want to go back to their country. They too want to see an end to the war.
Pero también el Plan Colombia mandó soldados de los Estados Unidos a mi país. Ellos también quieren regresar. Si se quedan allí en Colombia, no solamente serán puestos prisioneros, como ya sucede con 3 de ellos, sino que entrarán en el camino de la corrupción que genera el narcotráfico, como ya sucede en varios casos de prostitución infantil que han generado, de tráfico de cocaína que han generado los mismos soldados norteamericanos en Colombia, en las muertes de civiles que ellos han generado en una descomposición que no es más sino una parte del paisaje generalizado de la descomposición de la sociedad y de la política en Colombia.
But in Colombia, Plan Colombia has sent U.S. soldiers to my country, and they want to go home as well. If they stay, they may well become prisoners, as is already the case of 3 of them. Or they may fall into, the more time they're there, the more likely they'll fall into the corruption of drug trafficking. And for example, there already have been cases of child prostitution. There have been cases of cocaine trafficking involving U.S. soldiers. There have been cases of U.S. soldiers involved in the deaths of civilians, deaths that they've caused, which is part, in cases of decomposition that are part of the generalized decomposition of Colombian society and politics.
Esta conversación entre los pueblos latinos, afrodescendientes, indígenas y anglosajones de este continente tiene que hablar también de Colombia.
And this conversation among Latinos, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and Anglos has to also take in as a subject what's happening in Colombia.
Ha fracasado completamente una política hecha en esta ciudad por medio de la cual se creía que se podía detener el flujo de cocaína envenenando nuestras tierras con lluvias de toneladas de venenos, haciendo culpable a las matas de hoja de coca y no del consumo.
And there's been a total failure of a policy that was designed in this city, designed to stop cocaine, the rain of tons of poison in the cities. And yet they blame the a plant, the coca leaf, for this problem.
Y ubicando erradamente, y yo creo que premeditadamente, el poder de las mafias allí donde no estaba, en unas simples matas vegetales y malezas de hoja de coca.
And mistakenly, and I think premeditatingly, situating the problem of drug trafficking in a place where it just wasn't at, which is some simple, mere coca plants.
La culpa no la tiene la hoja de la coca.
It's not the coca leaf's fault.
No es tan inteligente.
It's not that smart.
El poder real de la mafia colombiana, a diferencia de otras mafias del mundo, reside en que tiene poder, en que tiene Estado, en que ha logrado a través de más de 3 décadas capturar sectores enormes de la sociedad colombiana puestas a su servicio y sectores enormes del Estado colombiano en el nivel regional, en el nivel nacional y en las 3 ramas del poder público puestos a su servicio.
The real power of the Colombian mafia is unlike other mafias. Its real power is in the state. In over 30 years, the Colombian mafias have come to capture huge sectors of Colombian society and of the Colombian state at the regional level, in various regions, at the national level, and all 3 branches of government.
Simplemente repetimos un error de la historia. Hitler no hubiera sido sino un triste, mal pintor de obras plásticas si no hubiera capturado el Estado. Stalin no hubiera sido sino un muy mal revolucionario si no hubiera capturado el Estado.
We've simply repeated a fundamental mistake of history. Hitler would have been no more than a mediocre painter had he not captured the state. Stalin would have been no more than a bad revolutionary had he not captured the state.
Pero el Estado es como el Viagra.
¿Cómo el qué?
Viagra.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
No conoce el de esa materia. Pero... es un potenciador. Si un criminal llega al Estado, potencia el crimen. Es por eso que Hitler pudo matar 50 millones de europeos y Stalin hacer lo propio con su propio país.
But the state is like Viagra. Interpreter hadn't heard that, so he said he doesn't know about that. And it is something that strengthens it, whatever it's getting into. So, had Hitler not captured the state, he would not have murdered 50 million people, and had Stalin not captured the state, he wouldn't have done the same.
El narcotráfico, al capturar el poder político en Colombia y fragmentos muy importantes del Estado, potenció su capacidad de crimen y generó el genocidio en Colombia.
The drug traffickers captured a great amount of political power in major parts of the state, and this greatly bolstered their capacity to carry out crime in Colombia.
Enseñó a los jóvenes en Colombia a descuartizar en vida seres humanos, solamente con la intención de producir el máximo de dolor posible para que los sobrevivientes pudieran silenciarse para siempre.
It taught young people to dismember people alive, just to maximize the amount of pain in people, so as to ensure that the survivors would not do anything or say anything about it.
Quemó caseríos, expulsó decenas de miles de personas, millones de personas de los campos colombianos, llenó a Colombia de fosas comunes, generó tal tipo de terror y de pavor que millones de colombianos se arrodillaron ante sus designios.
They burnt hamlets, they expelled tens of thousands, indeed millions of people. They sowed mass graves throughout Colombia. They infused Colombia with terror and fright.
Y en medio de ese genocidio que ha habido en Colombia, unas cuantas voces hablaron en su momento y yo quiero hacerles un reconocimiento.
And to the point that millions of people kneeled down before them. And through this genocide, it took so many lives, and I'd like to acknowledge some of them right here and now.
Jesús María Valle, defensor de derechos humanos en Antioquia, denunció la masacre del Aro ante el gobernador de ese entonces, Álvaro Uribe Vélez. Recibió, como siempre, un insulto y a la semana siguiente fue asesinado en su oficina.
Jesus María Valle was a human rights advocate in Antioquia. He denounced the El Aro massacre to the then governor of Antioquia, Álvaro Uribe. And as was generally the case, in response he was insulted, and a week later he was murdered.
Eduardo Umaña Mendoza, asesinado. Mario y Elsa Calderón, defensor de desplazados de Córdoba, asesinados con su hijo menor de edad.
Eduardo Umaña Mendoza, human rights defender, was murdered. Mario and Elsa Calderón, who defended the displaced of Córdoba, were murdered along with their child.
El padre Javier Giraldo, que me enseñó las técnicas de la investigación.
Father Javier Giraldo, who taught me investigative techniques.
Gracias a Dios vivo.
And thanks to God, he is alive.
Las organizaciones CINEP, la Comisión Colombiana de Juristas, MINGA, CODES.
Human rights organizations such as CINEP, the Colombian Commission of Jurists, MINGA, CODES.
Y fundamentalmente las víctimas en Colombia. Primero, las víctimas, que son millones de colombianos.
First and foremost, the victims in Colombia, millions of victims in Colombia.
Y tengo que agradecer en Estados Unidos a el Instituto para los Estudios Políticos, a Colombia Human Rights Committee.
In the United States, I must thank the Institute for Policy Studies, the Colombia Human Rights Committee,
a Latinoamérica Working Group,
Latin America Working Group,
a Steelworkers y sus dirigentes Leo Gerard y Dan Kovalik,
the United States Steelworkers and their leaders Leo Gerard and Dan Kovalik,
a Adam Isaacson, al Center for International Policy,
Adam Isaacson, CIP, Center for International Policy,
Colombia Support Network y a US Office on Colombia.
The Colombia Support Network, the United States Office on Colombia.
Son los que hacen posible un diálogo entre civilizaciones, entre nuestros pueblos.
All of these have made possible a dialogue between civilizations, between our peoples.
Y creo que han hecho posible que el Plan Colombia en este año haya cambiado fundamentalmente.
And I think they've made it possible for Plan Colombia to undergo fundamental changes this year.
De ese plan de fumigaciones, de ese plan de invasión militar sobre nuestro territorio, hemos pasado a una financiación con recursos del presupuesto federal para las víctimas, disculpen la palabra para, no se debe mencionar, hacia las víctimas, hacia el aparato judicial que hoy valorosamente está haciendo las investigaciones de los altos funcionarios y su ligazón con el genocidio y el narcotráfico, la Corte Suprema de Justicia, la Fiscalía. Creo que hemos empezado a construir el camino de un verdadero Plan Colombia hacia la verdad y por las víctimas del país.
And they've made it possible for this Plan Colombia to move away from fumigations and military invasions of our country and to move towards spending U.S. federal money for the victims, for supporting the judicial apparatus that has valiantly stood up to and investigated high-level officials who've been and their involvement in genocide and in drug trafficking, particularly in the Supreme Court and in the Office of the Attorney General, moving towards a Plan Colombia for truth and for the victims.
Aunque esta ley puede ser vetada por el presidente Bush, parece que va a ser vetada, invito a los congresistas de los Estados Unidos, a través suyo, señora Schakowsky, para que mantengan esa tesis, no solamente este año, sino que la profundicen en los años venideros. Si algún destino digno tiene el dinero de los contribuyentes norteamericanos, es precisamente ayudar a las víctimas y descubrir la verdad de los nexos entre políticos, funcionarios públicos, narcotráfico y genocidio en Colombia.
And though this legislation may be vetoed by President Bush, it appears that it will be. I would invite you, and particularly through you, Congresswoman Schakowsky, this year and persevering in future years, to continue such that if the dignity, so that there can be a dignified policy, a dignified destiny of these monies supporting the victims, and the efforts to reveal the connections between politicians, public officials, and drug trafficking and genocide.
Tengo que hablar de otros dos temas, pero aquí aparece algo que dice no more time, pero yo no entiendo el inglés.
I have to cover two more points, but I've gotten a note that says no more time. I don't understand English, though.
Así que intentaré ser breve. El segundo tema de este diálogo es el Tratado de Libre Comercio.
So I'll try to be brief. The second topic is the Free Trade Agreement.
Queremos transformar este llamado libre comercio por un comercio justo.
We want to transform the so-called free trade into fair trade.
Y pasa básicamente por reconocer una realidad del agro y del mundo rural colombiano.
And this basically involves understanding a certain reality of Colombian agriculture in the rural world in Colombia.
Los narcotraficantes se quedaron con la mayor parte de las tierras fértiles del país.
The drug traffickers have ended up with most of the fertile lands in the country.
Solo 10,000 poseedores de tierras de los 3,5 millones han logrado capturar el 62% de la superficie cultivable.
Only 10,000 of the 3.5 million landowners have captured 62% of arable lands.
La mayoría de ellos son narcotraficantes y testaferros, jefes paramilitares y asesinos.
Most of them are drug traffickers, front men, and people involved in genocide, murderers.
Y son los únicos que podrán sobrevivir la competencia libre entre el mundo agrario colombiano y el mundo agrario de los Estados Unidos.
And they're the only ones who are going to be able to survive the free competition between the Colombian agriculture and U.S. agriculture.
Yo los invito a ustedes, señores congresistas, y a ustedes, señores ciudadanos, a no aprobar ese tratado de libre comercio a favor del narcotráfico en Colombia.
I call on you, distinguished members of Congress and distinguished citizens, to not approve that free trade agreement, which is an agreement to benefit drug traffickers in Colombia.
Si quieren, lo renegociamos en el próximo gobierno. Si quieren, nos sentamos a conversar entre la sociedad colombiana y la sociedad de los Estados Unidos. Pero un comercio justo implica, por lo menos, que las tierras tomadas por los narcotraficantes en Colombia, bañadas en cocaína y sangre, tengan que ser entregadas de nuevo a los campesinos y a los pequeños y medianos empresarios de este país.
But we could renegotiate it in the next administration if you'd like and continue this dialogue between the United States and Colombia. But fair trade has to mean at the very least that those lands that have been taken by the drug traffickers, bathed in cocaine and blood, have to be given back to the poor peasant farmers.
Simplemente para seguir una consigna bíblica.
Just to follow a note from the Bible.
La Biblia la leí mucho en mis años de tortura y cárcel.
I read the Bible quite a bit in my years of torture and imprisonment.
Te ganarás el pan con el sudor de la frente.
You will win the bread with the sweat of your forehead.
Y no matando al vecino.
And not by killing your neighbor.
Y un último punto que quisiera dejar como propuesta en esto que puede ser una conversación entre pueblos diferentes.
And one final point, which I leave with you as a proposal in this conversation between different peoples.
Y que ojalá sea también una conversación entre gobiernos diferentes.
And which I hope could also become a conversation between different governments.
El de ustedes que cambia el año entrante y ojalá el nuestro que cambia en el 2010.
Yours, which will be changing next year, and I would hope ours, which we hope will change in 2010.
Es la paz.
Peace.
Es el tercer tema que hoy no existe en la agenda entre nuestros dos países.
And that's the third topic that is not even on the agenda between our two countries today.
Yo invito a los congresistas de los Estados Unidos, a través de usted, señora Schakowsky,
I invite the members of the U.S. Congress, through you, Ms. Schakowsky,
y a todos ustedes, ciudadanas y ciudadanas de este país,
and through all of you, citizens of this country,
a participar del complejo, dificilísimo, pero impostergable trabajo por sacar a la sociedad colombiana de la guerra.
to participate in the complex, difficult, but impossible to postpone task of helping Colombian society emerge from war.
Los problemas del TLC o del Plan Colombia son nada comparados con los problemas del conflicto armado y la violencia en el país.
The problems of the FTA and Plan Colombia are nothing compared to the problems of the armed conflict and violence in Colombia.
Yo he decidido cambiar mi actividad parlamentaria dedicada a hacer estos debates que vieron en la pantalla sobre el paramilitarismo por empezar el trabajo por la paz en Colombia.
I've begun to change my work in the Colombian Congress from the debates on paramilitarism, which you saw depicted in the short video, to a concentrated effort to help bring peace to Colombia.
Y creo que podemos, no es por miedo, ¿no?
And it's not out of fear.
Creo que podemos hacerlo a través de un instrumento fundamental que podríamos construir entre nuestras dos naciones.
And I think we could do it through a fundamental instrument that we could build as between our two nations,
Una conferencia internacional de paz hacia Colombia,
an international peace conference for Colombia,
en donde... One moment, please. En donde poderes fundamentales del mundo,
in which fundamental powers of the world,
sociedades del mundo,
different societies of the world,
los factores de la violencia en Colombia,
the different factors of violence in Colombia,
el Estado colombiano,
and the Colombian
las
state,
FARC, el ELN,
that is to say the Colombian state, the FARC, the
y
ELN,
fundamentalmente la sociedad colombiana,
and in particular Colombian society,
puedan sentarse a discutir a profundidad
can sit down for an in-depth discussion
cuáles son los caminos eficaces que permiten sacar a nuestro país de la violencia y de la guerra de 40 años que tenemos.
what might be the effective paths for allowing Colombia to emerge from the 40 years of violence and war that we've been suffering.
Y por eso quiero ofrecer también este premio a un hombre incógnito.
And that's why I'd also like to offer this award to an unknown man.
Se llama Ramiro Rueda.
His name is Ramiro Rueda.
Lo conocí porque quien era su novia en el pasado, en una tienda comercial en alguna calle de Bogotá, se apartó, me llamó a un rincón y me dijo que si me podía abrazar.
And I met him because his ex-girlfriend who worked in a store in Bogotá called me aside and asked me if she could give me an embrace.
Yo esperaba uno de los insultos tradicionales de los uribistas.
I was expecting one of the usual insults from one of the Uribistas.
Ella me contó que Ramiro Rueda había caído en combate siendo teniente de caballería en un combate con el M-19 en 1986.
She told me that Ramiro Rueda had been killed in combat. He had been a cavalry lieutenant, and this was in combat with the M-19 in 1986.
Y se interrumpió brutalmente su amor.
And this brutally interrupted her amorous relationship with him.
Ella, sollozando, me pidió perdón.
And sobbing, she asked for my forgiveness.
Y no pude entenderlo porque quien tenía que pedirle perdón era yo.
Or she asked that I forgive her, but I couldn't understand her because I was the one who had to ask that she forgive me.
Y no por haber pertenecido al M-19,
And not for having belonged to the M-19,
sino por no haber sabido acortar debidamente los tiempos de la guerra en Colombia.
but because of not having known how to properly shorten the time of war in Colombia.
En esa demora se acabó su amor.
And in that period, in that delay, her love came to an end.
Pero entre los sollozos y la petición de perdón de esa señora, sentí que siendo ella víctima, era un profundo proceso y quería un profundo proceso de reconciliación.
But I understood between her sobs and her request for forgiveness that she was a victim, that she had needed and required a profound process of change.
Y creo que la mayoría de los colombianos quieren ese proceso de reconciliación desde lo más hondo de sus corazones.
And a profound process of reconciliation. I think the majority of Colombians want that profound process of reconciliation from the bottom of their hearts.
Para que centenares de miles de novias como ella no pierdan a su teniente de caballería.
so that hundreds of thousands of girlfriends like her not lose their cavalry lieutenant.
Centenares de miles de madres no pierdan a sus hijos.
So that hundreds of thousands of mothers not lose their sons.
Centenares de miles de esposas no pierdan a sus esposos.
And so that hundreds of thousands of wives not lose their husbands.
Y centenares de miles de hijas no pierdan a sus padres.
And so that hundreds and thousands of daughters not lose their fathers.
Por esos millones de víctimas de amores rotos.
For those millions of victims of broken hearts.
De tenientes de caballería muertos.
Of dead cavalry lieutenants.
Como Ramiro Rueda, al cual le ofrezco este homenaje.
Like Ramiro Rueda, to whom I offer this tribute.
Es que tenemos que hacer conjunta, colectivamente y como expresión de este nuevo diálogo de civilizaciones.
We need to come together collectively as an expression of this new dialogue among civilizations.
El enorme esfuerzo de construir la paz en Colombia.
And make this enormous effort to build peace in Colombia.
Así que más allá del Plan Colombia.
So beyond Plan Colombia.
Más allá del Tratado de Libre Comercio.
Beyond the Free Trade Agreement.
Más allá del transcurrir de las mercancías y los capitales.
And beyond the back and forth of merchandise and capital.
Los convoco a ustedes como seres humanos.
I call on you as human beings.
A que trabajemos comúnmente.
Let's work together.
La Conferencia Internacional por la Paz de Colombia.
To make a reality of the International Peace Conference for Colombia.
Gracias a ustedes, muy amables.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Senator Petro. First, my apologies, but also I want to say if we had even a dozen senators in this country who were as brave and as dogged in standing up to bad presidents and to injustice as you are, we would be much further along towards a more just society. So. Before I introduce our next presenter, I want to acknowledge just a few others in this audience. We're honored to have some of our closest allies on Capitol Hill here in addition to Jan Schakowsky. We've had Representative Dennis Kucinich, Representative Bob Filner, and we are also delighted to have several representatives of other governments. Please hold your applause on these since there are several. From Zambia, the Honorable Member of Parliament, Given Lubinda. And then these next, you'll notice an interesting pattern. From Bolivia, Ambassador Gustavo Guzman and Energy Minister Carlos Villegas. From Cuba, Ambassador Dagoberto Rodriguez. From Peru, former Senator Javier Diaz-Canseco. From the Chilean Embassy, Pablo Palma and Rodrigo Meza. And from Venezuela, Ambassador Bernardo Alvarez. We applaud you for being here, and we applaud the rise of democracy in Latin America. Now to our next presenter. Most of you in this room have seen the award-winning play written by our next presenter. Some of you have even acted in it. The Vagina Monologues is a true theatrical phenomenon, translated into over 45 languages, performed in 76 countries. Pretty much every self-respecting Hollywood actress has performed in it, from Meryl Streep to Lily Tomlin to Glenn Close, and so on and on. But it didn't end there. The play led our presenter to create V-Day, a global movement to stop violence against women and girls. Her more recent play, The Good Body, addresses why women of all cultures and backgrounds, whether undergoing Botox injections or living beneath burqas, feel compelled to change the way they look. She has devoted her life to stopping violence, envisioning a planet in which women and girls will be free to thrive rather than merely survive. She has also devoted considerable energy to calling for an end to this illegal and immoral war. Please welcome Eve Ensler.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel honored to be here tonight, particularly on the heels of listening to the senator who moves me to my core, and for risking his life, for standing in the face of danger, and for standing up for truth in the midst of genocide. I want to say also to be at the Institute of Policy Studies and to be in a crowd of people who have fought with their lives for peace and justice and equality gives me great hope and confidence and stamina. You know, I was thinking about this award I'm about to give, and this last year in V-Day we focused on women in conflict zones. So I had an opportunity to travel to many places and to meet with women from Lebanon, from Haiti, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and recently I spent a great deal of time in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I have to say that there I hit a threshold of understanding of what war can do, particularly to the bodies of women, who are the holders of life and the future. And I have to say, being in Washington, here we are on the heels of the potential of another war that this country is thinking, or this administration, or this empire, I don't know what it is at this point, is thinking of launching towards Iran. I have to say, here and now, that if we are brave and bold as American citizens, we will not let this happen, and we will do everything in our power to make sure it does not happen. Even before this horrific war and occupation of Iraq began, families of young women and men who were facing possible deployment to Iraq began to mobilize to try to stop it. Just a few months after the invasion of Iraq, IPS presented its 2003 Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Award to Military Families Speak Out, an organization of several thousand family members of U.S. soldiers in recognition of their courage and commitment in opposing the rising war. Over the next several years, MFSO and other military organizations, Gold Star Families of Peace, Veterans for Peace, and soon Iraq Veterans Against the War emerged at the very center of our peace and justice movement, taking their place at the very core of anti-counter-recruitment and veterans' rights mobilizations. Today, while military families and veterans remain central to our movement, a whole new component of military resistance has emerged. Active duty GIs who have taken up publicly the demand to end the occupation and bring all the troops home. GI resistance has a long and defiant history in the U.S., perhaps most powerfully during the Vietnam War. And now we're seeing the latest incarnation of that proud legacy with the creation of the Appeal for Redress. These exceptional, and I got to meet them this afternoon, exceptional is accurate, exceptional active duty service members, almost all of them young, many of them people of color, almost all of them in the lower ranks of the military hierarchy, have taken an extraordinary risk. They have taken the words of our Constitution as truth, and it's lucky we still have one. So we want to bless them for that. Knowing that the joining the military entails giving up almost all constitutional rights, even beyond those we watch being shredded day by an administration unaccountable and out of control. These are service people of whom we can all be proud, whose understanding of duty means the duty to speak truth to power. We honor them tonight. Please welcome Liam Madden, co-founder of the Appeal for Redress, who will accept the Letelier-Moffitt Human Rights Award for his brave organization. Liam?
Thank you. Thank you so much. On behalf of the more than 2,000 service members that have signed the Appeal for Redress, I'd like to say I'm deeply humbled and honored to be recognized, to have the Appeal for Redress recognized tonight. And before I introduce my partners, I'd like to take the opportunity to let you know what it means to be mentioned in the same breath as Orlando Letelier and Ronni Karpen Moffitt. To me, it means obligation. An obligation of those that live in the belly of the beast. An obligation of those who have the power of proximity. An obligation to our ideals, everyone in this room, to our ideals, but not only to our ideals, but to the Senator Gustavo Petros, to the Orlando Leteliers, to the Ronni Karpen Moffitts, to the people of Cuba and Bolivia and Zambia, to the people all over the world that rely on us. Before I introduce my good friend Jonathan, I'd like to thank the esteemed Congresswoman who mentioned the word legitimacy earlier, about while she was extending all of her adulation to the senator from Colombia. I'd like to thank you, Congresswoman, for defending the remaining shreds of legitimacy in our government by selecting to impeach a war criminal, our Vice President, Dick Cheney. So I'm gonna hand the mic off to someone that gives me hope for my generation, someone who keeps the spirit of revolution alive for when my generation is the generation that, our generation is the generation that makes decisions in this world. And I mean a revolution of conscience and a revolution of justice. I like to say that you can tell Jonathan's been somewhere because he leaves a puddle of justice on the ground. So please welcome, warmly welcome. No, make it a hot welcome. Celebrate a soldier, a sailor, a service member, someone who serves justice, Jonathan Hutto.
I promise all of you, we're going to stay within time limit. I promise you. I promise you that. I promise you.
Unless you need it translated into more than one language, and we can stay up longer.
I promise you. I'm going to make this succinct, but also, very strong and to the point. I was off the coast of Iraq in January 2006 on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt when I received this book in the mail from a professor, a friend of mine at Howard University. It was a book that I had never read, and it's a history that was unknown to me, and I thought that I knew just about all there was about at least Vietnam history coming out of Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. King, Muhammad Ali, Julian Bond, John Lewis. I mean, how could you not? But I did not know that there was a movement of active duty military within the ranks itself during Vietnam. And one of the things that inspired me and inspired all of us was an open petition that they took out. The irony that this book was written by a doctoral student who's sitting before us today, Dr. David Court, right here. Oh, stand up, Bob. Come on. Come on up here with us. Come on. I said we're going to stay within time now. The irony that this book was written by a doctoral student 32 years ago, a student of Mark Raskin at the Institute for Policy Studies. And so 32 years later, this book being an inspiration to us, an open appeal they took out in the New York Times, 1,365 of those active duty GIs during Vietnam. And so what I said to myself, and as I contacted my friend Lindsay, who I knew was in the active duty ranks, and as I met Lim in Norfolk in June of that year when we brought Dr. Court down, is that if they could do that during that time, then what prevents us from trying to do something to give voice and to give purpose and to give meaning to our service? Just because we took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, does not mean that we've sacrificed our rights under that Constitution. It's because of that, and it's based on the Military Whistleblower Protection Act that gives all of us the right to appeal to members of Congress on our own time, off duty, off base, and without any reprisals for having done so. The result, over 2,000 active duty members of the military have signed from 10 countries all around the world, 85% enlisted, at least 60% of them at least having done one tour of duty in Iraq. But most importantly, setting a stage for us to build a democracy movement within the military. We have seen every element of our society, press this government through the ballot box, through the marches, through legislation, through letters, but we got to get the voices of our constituency. And we believe that when those voices move, we'll be able to not only bring the troops home, take care of them when they get here, but also bring justice and bring some respect back to this country, because those violations are committed in our names, all right? Two final points I'll make. One is, and this is picking back off of Eve, we talk about the service members in Iraq constantly, and we should. Those are our brothers and sisters, but also our brothers and sisters not just within the ranks of the military, but throughout the entire world. And so we not only speak about those 3,000+ who have sacrificed their lives and did so honorably because the government asked them to do so, but we also speak for the hundreds and thousands of Iraqi civilians whose communities have been decimated, whose hospitals have been destroyed, whose schools have been destroyed, whose lives have been turned upside down by illegal, unjust, and immoral war. And finally, with 1 minute remaining, I read these words as a young freshman at Howard, and it was implanted in my head as soon as I read them. A gentleman by the name of George Jackson. I had never heard of George Jackson. And people honored him as the father of the modern-day prison movement. Many of us, some of you before my time, remember the rebellion in Attica that was inspired by his advocacy for prisoners' rights. But when I read those words, anytime I speak, anytime I have anything to say, I end by saying, settle your quarrels, come together, understand the true reality of our situation, understand that fascism is here, that millions have died that could have been saved, and that millions more would die or live half-butchered, poor lives if we fail to act. Do what must be done. Embrace your love and humanity and a worldwide revolution. Join us. Join us and give up your life for the people. Thank you.
Thank you. You have just met the heart and soul of a peace movement that can end this war. Now, to our final presenter. Every 6 to 7 years, the Letelier-Moffitt Selection Committee votes to give a special human rights award because it feels that there is an issue that is so compelling that it must be recognized. The man who will present this award is the Executive Director of the Leadership Council on Civil Rights, the nation's largest and most diverse civil and human rights coalition. Established in 1950 by giants of the civil rights movement, it has tirelessly promoted the passage and implementation of civil rights laws designed to end discrimination and achieve equal opportunity for all Americans. It will not surprise you that the Leadership Council for Civil Rights has been central to the national legislative campaign on behalf of every major civil rights law since 1957. Our presenter is well known. I'm going to embarrass Wade for just a second more. Our presenter is well known for his expertise on a wide range of civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights issues. Currently, he's working on voting rights and election reform, federal judicial appointments, economic justice, educational equity, hate crimes. And under his leadership, the Leadership Council is also working on civil liberties and civil rights emanating from the so-called war against terrorism. He has also been a leader of the movement that he's about to tell you about, Wade Henderson.
Thank you. Come on. Thank you. I was about to tell John that was the best obituary I've heard in a long time, but I will refrain from the obvious. First of all, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I don't say that to many audiences, but I feel that I can say that here and know that I am at home in the right crowd. So I'm honored to do that. I want to thank John Kavanaugh. I want to thank the Letelier-Moffitt Award Selection Committee, both for the honor of inviting me to present tonight, but more importantly, for the honor being bestowed this evening on an extraordinary organization that has lifted up one of the great unheralded civil rights and human rights issues of our time, and that is DC Vote. John mentioned I had an organization called the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. We are 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. But we are dependent upon the individual contributions of ordinary citizens and individuals who are here under the protection of the Constitution, who strive every day to make America reconcile its ideal with the reality of life in this country. And that's what we're here to talk about this evening. Now, this is an extraordinary occasion. I mean, we've had 3 incredible honorees. We've just heard from 2 of them. And we've had incredible presenters. And I have to say it's a real treat for me not only to follow Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, whom I have long admired, and who that series in the Washington Post doesn't do her justice for the commitment that she has shown in trying to end an unjust war. But also, I'm following Eve Ensler, and you know, the Vagina Monologues are famous, and it's a real pleasure to be here. But change is in the air. You know, when I came here this evening, I noticed that the crowd was extraordinary. People had gathered early, they were chatting, there is an excitement in the air. Part of it is, of course, old friends getting together and swapping stories about the future. But part of it is the politics of change. You know, the winds of democracy are sweeping across South America. Hopefully those winds will find their way to the shores of the Potomac, and we too will have democracy in this country. It'd be nice to think that that might happen. And, you know, even among an organization committed to democracy and justice, you know, my friends know that I am scrupulously nonpartisan. But I walked into this evening and I was given a keychain which is entitled Bush's Last Day, 01-2009. And there are 460 days and counting to the time that we have change in this country. Now, you know, I thought about whether I should make that comment because, as I said, I am nonpartisan, and on the Hill, for anything that I do, it takes the votes of both Democrats and Republicans. But, you know, it's not partisan to want an end to an unjust war. It is not partisan. It's not partisan to demand an end to the killing of civilians and the death of our own soldiers and the squandering of our own national treasure. That ain't partisan, okay? That ain't partisan. And civil rights are not partisan. They are part of the American legacy. And so when we talk about voting rights and civil rights, we're talking about something that is beyond partisanship. We're talking about something that is fundamentally ingrained in the constitutional rights of every American citizen. And that brings me to the honor that we're about to bestow this evening. Most of you probably had not heard of DC Vote until the last couple of years, because this is an organization that is not quite 10 years old, but has made an extraordinary impact in changing the politics, not just of Washington, but of the nation as a whole. Because DC Vote knows a fundamental truth. If you don't vote, you don't count. Voting is the language of democracy. And we know that in this country, if you don't have a vote to give, then you don't count as a citizen. And nowhere is that more clear or more ironic than right here in the nation's capital. If we can fight to bring democracy to Baghdad, God damn it, we can fight to bring democracy to the Potomac. To the Potomac. To the Potomac. Now, one thing I do know for sure, that there are lots of people who help to make up DC Vote. DC Vote is not just an organization, it is an organization of organizations. 70 groups strong have made a commitment to bring voting rights and democracy to the nation's capital. Many of the supporters, activists, board members, leaders of the organization are here tonight, and I would simply like them to stand up to be recognized. They are so outstanding. Come on, Dan, stand up. Come on, all the activists who've been a part of DC Vote. The staff. You guys have just done outstanding work. And before I call them up to take this award, I want to tell a little story, and this is going to be very quick, very quick. A few years ago, my father died, and I was burying him. I am from the nation's capital, from D.C. My father was born here. He was a veteran of World War II and a war hero. And when he died, I didn't know the extent of his accomplishments until his death. A lot of that information became available to me. And I was touched by the contribution that he had made to this country and the recognition that when he returned from the war, he returned to a segregated country and a segregated nation's capital where he grew up. At the same time that we were burying my father, there was a young man of 21 years old who was also being buried. His name was Darrell Dent. He was the first soldier from the District of Columbia killed in Iraq. He was a member of the National Guard who had volunteered to serve, but as I think Eve Ensler so correctly said, he was drafted by poverty and by the poor quality of the schools available to him and by limited job opportunities and really no chance to make a significant difference in his life and the life of his family other than through military service. Darrell Dent died because he believed in the value of fighting for democracy, and he was doing that abroad. And when he came home to this country, recognizing that we have no democracy, he was brought back for his burial. And so while we celebrate this wonderful gift of democracy that we have in this country, often we take it for granted. I want to dedicate the award that we are about to present tonight to DC Vote to the memory of Darrell Dent and to all the other Darrell Dents in this country, but specifically here in the nation's capital, who make sacrifices every day, but who don't get the basic rewards of American citizenship, and that is the reward of being able to vote and to shape the democracy that affects their daily lives. So I have the pleasure now of inviting two of DC Vote's leaders to come to the podium to accept this Letelier-Moffitt Award, one of the great human rights awards of our time. I'd like to invite Bruce Spiva, the chairman of the board of DC Vote, and Aliyah Zerka, its executive director. And I'd like to invite you to join me in celebrating the extraordinary accomplishments of DC Vote and all those individuals who have made this possible. Please. And one last thing, guys, one last thing. You know, we had a vote just a few weeks ago. This bill passed the House of Representatives to give D.C. the right to vote. But it was stalled in the Senate by 3 votes. We were 3 votes short of what we needed. This was the first Voting Rights Act in modern history ever filibustered, all right, by a Congress, a Voting Rights Act to be filibustered, and we're going to make them pay for that. We believe that this issue has to become a national issue, and we are confident that with the help of DC Vote and all the other active organizations that are part of this, we're going to get those 3 votes, and we will be back in the Senate chamber this coming spring asking senators to vote in favor of democracy for DC. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Spiva to the podium. Bruce?
Thank you. Yeah, isn't it ironic, Wade, that a bill to bring democracy to the capital of the United States would be denied a vote in the United States Senate, an up or down vote? Let me begin by saying a few thank yous, and the first thank you that I want to say is to the man standing here, Aliyah Zerka, who is a true what Martin Luther King called a drum major for justice. He has really brought our organization, he's the executive director of our organization, and has brought us from a struggling organization really trying to gain some traction on this issue to where we are today, having passed this bill through the House of Representatives and coming 3 votes shy of defeating the filibuster in the Senate, and we're going to come back and we're going to get this all the way through before the end of this congressional term. So I want to thank Alir, and I want to thank the great staff, many of whom are here today, who work tirelessly every day on this issue to keep it front and center. I want to thank one of the founders of our organization, Daniel Solomon, who's sitting here. Please stand, Daniel. He's quieter, but another drum major for justice. He doesn't beat the drum as loudly, but he's certainly there's no one more stalwart in his commitment to this issue. He's behind the scenes, but he's been a true force and made it all possible for us to accomplish with so many others. And Wade Henderson and the LCCR, we have many coalition partners, as Wade has said, but none who've done more to advance this cause with all the other important issues that Wade and his organization have on their plate in terms of civil rights and voting rights around the country, has pushed this issue in the Congress and made this a priority and said to the Congress that this issue is not just a local issue. This is an issue of human rights, and it goes to the core of our constitutional democracy. It goes to the legitimacy of our government that 600,000 citizens, American citizens who pay taxes and fight in wars, are denied any representation whatsoever in the Congress of the United States. So thank you to Wade Henderson. And I'm going to ask her to come up and say a few words in a minute, but thank you also to Aviva Kemp, one of our board members, who has also been one of our great stalwart champions of democracy. Talks about this issue. She's a great filmmaker, a documentary maker, and she talks about this issue wherever she goes, to whoever she can, whether it's Oprah Winfrey or Mayor Fenty, who needs no encouragement, but anyone, anywhere, Aviva is out there championing this cause. And then finally, I do want to thank this organization. We are so grateful to you for this recognition. And I have to say I'm truly humbled and was touched. I found myself near tears, really at tears, many times during the previous presentations. Truly humbled to stand up here after someone like Senator Petro, who's risked his life for issues of democracy and for the appeal for redress, the young men and women who stood up against the war, against great risk. And I have to say that although we in D.C. vote and we in the movement for democracy here in D.C. Have not faced the same physical risks as others, although there have been times, and there's still times in our country where those who've stood up for voting rights have faced great physical risks, such as Viola Liuzzo, who was killed on a country road in Alabama fighting for democracy there, and John Lewis, who's now a congressman, was beaten near to death fighting for democracy. And so that is a part of our history, and we stand on those people's shoulders. But there are ways in which people can be kept down that don't necessarily take a gun or a bomb. Thank God nobody has tried to bomb us or jail us as of yet. But in this town, there are some who believe that the thing that they have to fear the most is being seen as naive, of taking on a cause that has no chance of prevailing. That's the greatest political sin in this city of consultants and people who believe themselves to be politically in the know, is to stand up for what is viewed as a losing cause, and that's exactly what this was considered 9 years ago when this organization was founded by Daniel Solomon and others. This was a loser's issue. It's a local issue. Nobody cares about that. Of course, we have no vote in the Congress, and so none of the congressmen and women need our allegiance. What we have been able to do in these 9 years is to raise this issue to the profile that it really deserves, and that is, it is a fundamental civil rights issue. And we have been able to embolden, I think, people around the city to stand up, to take risks, and to keep coming back, because every time that we've overcome one hurdle, we've faced another setback. In the House this spring, they tried to attach a gun amendment to the bill, and that looked like it had doomed it, and the papers said we were done. And we came back, and 5,000 people came out on a cold and windy and rainy day and said, no, this issue is important, and this issue is fundamental to us, and we are not going to be silent about it anymore. We're not happy with the state of affairs. And we came back 2 weeks later, and we passed it through the House. And we came, as I said a few weeks ago, close to getting it through the Senate. And when we get it through the Senate, and when we get it through the President's office, if it's not this President, it'll be the next President, but we will not stop fighting until the final day of this President's office to get him to sign it. We'll do everything necessary. We'll be back for the 2 senators, and that's what they're afraid of. And so, I see it says, please end your remarks. I'll close before introducing Aviva with the words of the old civil rights song, "The one thing that we got right is the day we started to fight." We're going to keep our eyes on the prize, and we're going to end this injustice. Aviva Kempner, filmmaker and board member, please come up.
I just want to say this is very personal for me because since '73, IPS has been my community, and I think tonight I especially think of Richard Barnett and Mark Raskin. Mark is speaking Friday night about 40 years since the March on Washington, and most of all, it's Orlando I think of. And I see Peter Rice there, and I remember a conversation we had about bringing Orlando here and the dignity and the leadership and the intellect he brought to that fight. And he inspires us, all of us who knew Orlando, and then, of course, Isabel continuing on. You may not know, but Lillian Montesino, who was his secretary at IPS, passed away 2 weeks ago in her 90s, and I think we should all think of her. But most of all, I want to ask, how many of us live in the District of Columbia? Okay, so I'm a board member at DC Vote, and wherever I go and wherever you go, you say we don't have voting rights. Because the most amazing thing is people don't know that. People in other cities, in other countries, and we've heard the poignant stories of our servicemen and, of course, of the struggle for human rights in Colombia. But it is such an underknown issue, and that's what we have to fight, is to bring it open. You have to put posters in your front lawn. You have to wear buttons. You should come to our Champions of Democracy meeting, gathering next Tuesday, like that, Danny, and join us there. But most of all, we have to get on the streets, in the lobby, in our own organizations, and just keep on passing that issue. DC does not have voting rights. And I have to remember one thing, what happened to Orlando, when Pinochet had the chutzpah to take his citizenship away. And Orlando said, I am a Chilean, I will always be a Chilean, and I will die a Chilean. Well, we who raised our hands, we are DC residents, we will always be DC residents, and my fellow DC residents, we deserve full voting rights. Voting rights now! Where's John? I'm giving 2 posters to DC Vote. Danny, raise your hand. You can come get, and a button. You all have to take the message. It takes a people to get voting rights.
Well, thank you to Wade and Alir and Aviva and Bruce and the posters and the buttons. You have now 500 new allies. Most of them are old allies in this struggle, and we won't stop till we win. Let me end with a huge thank you to Sena Chikata, who is over here, who and who, along with a wonderful team of IPS staff and volunteers, made this evening possible. I'm deeply proud to work with them all. And in the days to come, I foresee many victories in the struggles for justice coming because people in this room, some of whom have just met one another, tinker with history to create opportunities about which most of us can only dream. I want to invite you all now to stick around. There's desserts with the drinks in the next room. Meet the presenters, meet the awardees, and celebrate. Thank you all for coming.